When USS Enterprise, the eighth U.S. Navy vessel to bear that name, was commissioned on November 25, 1961, she set a still unbroken record. At 1,122 feet long, she was the longest warship ever built. She was also the world's first nuclear aircraft carrier, and she would see an astounding more than 5 decades of service across a dizzying number of operations, including being the first nuclear-powered warship to engage in combat. Yet the deadliest day of her long service didn't occur off the shores of Vietnam. Rather, it occurred off the shores of Hawaii. January 14th, 1969 demonstrated the risk that our sailors take every day when they go to defend our nation at sea.
The Naval Ordnance Test Station at China Lake was established during the Second World War as a base to test weapon systems being developed at Caltech University. A publication of the U.S. Department of the Interior explains that the need for vast open space to test and evaluate weaponry led Navy and Caltech planners to the remote site in the Mojave Desert, near the present-day city of Ridgecrest, California. The facility played a role in the development and testing of numerous weapon systems, including the proximity fuse, a critical World War II technical development, and the development of non-nuclear components of nuclear bombs. Among its important developments were the design and testing of air-launched rockets. One of those, a 5-inch rocket called the Zuni, after the name of a Native American tribe, first began production in 1957. An improvement over previous designs, the Zuni rocket was a folding-fin aircraft rocket, allowing the rocket to be fired from a tube, primarily the aluminum LAU-10A launcher pod. This made the rockets easier to reload and relatively inexpensive to mount on an aircraft. The system was modular, allowing for a range of payload options, including rockets used to illuminate targets and a ship-mounted rocket that dispersed aluminum foil chaff intended to decoy anti-ship missiles. But its most common payload was the simple high-explosive warhead that would disperse metal fragments, doing damage to structures, light vehicles, and personnel. The unguided rocket was more powerful and had a longer effective range than previous designs. While initially the rocket was envisioned as both an air-to-ground and air-to-air weapon, it was used almost exclusively as an air-to-ground rocket. Sebastian Roblin explains in a 2024 edition of Popular Mechanics. The goal was to engage point targets like tanks, ships, submarines, trains, and fortifications with munitions that hit harder than a plane's built-in machine guns and cannons, but with a greater accuracy than gravity bombs. The rockets were inexpensive, only some $400 while in mass production, allowing several to be fired, Roblin explains, to compensate for inaccuracy. The rocket was used primarily by the Navy and Marines, mounted on attack jets, fighter jets, and helicopters, where it was, Roblin writes, particularly favored for precisely targeting entrenched anti-aircraft guns and missile batteries. He writes that hundreds of thousands of Zuni missiles were expended during the war in Vietnam. It was a powerful, reliable weapon of such utility that remaining U.S. stocks were sent to Ukraine in 2024 for use in the ongoing war. Roblin notes that all 6,000 of the rockets transferred there were expended by the end of June 2024, representing possibly the extinction of the venerable weapons system. The Zuni rocket, however, did have drawbacks in both its engine and its warhead, as the Navy would discover. Roblin writes, ironically, no Soviet weapon came as close to crippling a large U.S. warship during the Cold War as the Zuni itself. The first notable incident occurred on July 29, 1967, aboard the aircraft carrier USS Forrestal. According to J. M. Kaela, writing in a 2022 edition of Naval History, more than 20 aircraft crowded the ship's aft flight deck, with barely walking room between them. With the aircraft fully fueled and armed, their engines were being spooled up, and pilots, along with plane and deck crews, were making last-minute checks for an 11 o'clock launch. A Zuni rocket, Mark 32, was mounted on an F-4B Phantom II fighter aircraft. 7 minutes before the mission was to launch, the Zuni rocket motor ignited. The rocket struck the wing of an A-4E Skyhawk attack bomber. The warhead didn't explode, but the strike ruptured the Skyhawk's external fuel tank, releasing and igniting some 400 gallons of jet fuel. The fire resulted in numerous explosions of ordnance on the fully armed aircraft, and in the resulting explosions and fire, 134 sailors were killed and 161 injured. Significant damage was done to the Forrestal, and numerous aircraft were destroyed or damaged. In the subsequent investigation, it was determined that there were several faults in the design of the LAU-10 launching pod that allowed an electrical surge that occurred as the pilot switched from external to internal power to reach the rocket. Procedures both in weapons handling and firefighting and damage control procedures were instituted as a result of the accident. But as it turns out, the Zuni rocket had another problem, as the 5,400-man crew of the USS Enterprise would discover. Enterprise was originally intended to be the lead ship in a class of 6 ships, but the reactor system, 8 AW2 nuclear reactors, proved too complex and expensive, leading to significant cost overruns. The further ships of the class were cancelled as the Navy sought a more economical alternative, which would eventually result in the Nimitz class, using 2 larger reactors rather than 8 small ones. Still, Enterprise would see long and distinguished service. She proved the value of nuclear propulsion in 1964, when along with the nuclear-powered guided missile cruisers USS Long Beach and USS Bainbridge, she circumnavigated the globe, sailing more than 30,000 miles without refueling. The following year, she deployed to Vietnam. The first missions by her air group in the conflict were launched on December 2, 1965, making her the first nuclear-powered ship to engage in combat. The pace of operations was astounding, with the ship nicknamed the Big E launching 125 sorties on its first day. The next day, December 3rd, Enterprise and her Air Wing 9 launched 211 sorties, 165 of which were strike sorties. The Air Group commander noted that was 34 greater than the record prior to Enterprise's arrival. In its first deployment, Enterprise pilots flew more than 13,000 sorties in 132 combat days. 14 of her airmen were lost in those operations. It was an experienced and veteran ship. The Air Group flew another 12,000 sorties in a second deployment between February and July 1968. The ship underwent an overhaul before beginning another deployment. Enterprise was still the only nuclear-powered aircraft carrier in the world. On January 14, 1969, in preparation for Enterprise's 4th deployment to Vietnam, Enterprise was 70 nautical miles southwest of Pearl Harbor, undergoing her final battle drill on the last day of an operational readiness inspection. Flight operations commenced at 0630. At 0818, Captain Kent Lee ordered the ship to turn to port, into the wind, planning for an 0830 launch of, Samuel Cox of the U.S. Navy History and Heritage Command explains, 6 F-4 Phantom II fighters, 7 A-7 Corsair II light attack jets, 1 RA-5C Vigilante photo reconnaissance aircraft, 1 EKA-3B tanker, and 1 E-2A Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft. As part of the flight operations, several MD-3 tow tractors were operating across the deck. With the earliest models coming into service in the 1950s, the MD-3, commonly called the Mule, was a multi-purpose military diesel. Powered by a 100-horsepower diesel engine, the tractor's approximately 8,500 pounds of draw pull was sufficient to move any aircraft on the ship. The tractor was specifically designed with a low silhouette, allowing it to operate under the aircraft wings. It was a versatile and reliable workhorse that, in addition to its towing ability, could be modified with modules in the rear of the tractor, including an aircraft engine starting unit. This unit provided bleed air that would spin up a jet turbine. The unit produces hot compressed air, which is directed to an air turbine starter attached to the main engine, using the bleed air's energy to rapidly spin the engine's compressor and shaft. This is a faster and lighter alternative to electronic starting, and was a common procedure on the carrier. MD-3A models with these units were commonly called Huffers. According to Cox, one such Huffer, driven by Airman John R. Webster, was operating on the port quarter of the flight deck outside the landing area. But Webster had made an error positioning the tractor, something that junior airman apprentice Dave Reynolds noticed, and to which he was attempting to call attention when the first explosion occurred. Michael Carlin, who was 21 years old at the time and helping to prepare jets for launch, wrote in his 2017 book, Trial, Ordeal of the USS Enterprise, that Reynolds noticed that the normally bright gold fuses of the Zuni warheads on one of the Phantom IIs had turned copper-colored. The exhaust from the Huffer is extremely hot, and the tractor had inadvertently been parked so that the blazing hot air was directed to the starboard wing of the Phantom II and its pod of 4 Zuni rockets. Unlike the Forrestal, it was not the rocket's engine that ignited, but its warhead. The Mark 32 rocket warhead was composed of 15 pounds of the high-explosive Compound B, a mix of Research Development Explosive, or RDX, and TNT. This mix produces an explosion that is approximately one-third stronger than just TNT, and the warhead was designed to produce thousands of fragments upon explosion. While Comp B is an effective military explosive, it is sensitive to heat. Cox writes that 358 degrees was sufficient to cook off the warhead, while the exhaust from the hover can be as hot as 850 degrees. At 08:19, the first Zuni rocket exploded. Webster was killed in the initial blast, which ruptured the fighter's two external fuel tanks, sending thousands of gallons of burning JP-5 fuel across the deck. Within a minute, the three other Zuni rockets in the pod exploded, followed by the four in the port wing. In 2014, Carlin told CBS News, "We had 8 rockets go off in the first 20 seconds. Shrapnel from Shaped Charge's warheads swept forward, and seamen rushed to fight the fire. There was a much larger problem. The aircraft was loaded with 6 Mark 82 500-pound bombs. 3 minutes after the fire started, the first of these 500-pound bombs exploded," Carlin told CBS. Now the bombs started going off, and that was a totally different ballgame there. 20-year-old Frank Peake was working on deck, just 200 feet from the explosion. In 2008, he told the Clarion News of Corydon, Indiana, "The force of the explosion picked me up and threw me several feet. Both his legs were broken, and he had shrapnel injuries in his back and legs. He was pulled away by another sailor. He wasn't the only man injured, and several men had perished in the initial explosion. Others had been thrown overboard." Elsewhere on the ship, Peake's friend Les Cubberley had ducked under a catwalk at the sound of the explosions. He told the paper, "My eyebrows were singed, but I wasn't hurt. Then I heard, 'General quarters, general quarters. This is not a drill.'" When he reached the flight deck, he described it as horrible. Sailor Daniel Noe was asleep in his bunk. He told Central California Valley's Eyewitness News 47 that the initial explosion threw him into a wall. He followed his first instinct and ran. He told the station that 2 other men from the room ran to the right, but he ran to the left. The decision saved his life. The other 2 men didn't make it. If I'd gone to the right, I probably would have died. The explosion had rocked the entire ship. On the bridge, Lee ordered the ship to continue its port turn so that the smoke could be blown away from the vessel. But the worst was yet to come. The explosion had blown an 8-by-7-foot hole in the deck, among other damage, disabling important parts of the fire control system, and burning fuel was starting fires 3 decks below. More 500-pound bombs started exploding. 2 more exploded, but then a bomb rack holding 3 detonated, rupturing a fuel tank of 6,000 gallons of JP-5. That detonation created a 22-foot by 18-foot hole in the deck, and the fuel exploded in what Cox described as a huge fireball. Lieutenant Commander Perry Gard told the Associated Press that as the fireball rose, I sat there fascinated and wondering what was going on. Then it dawned on me that I better get out of the plane. In all, Cox wrote, there were 18 explosions that blew 5 large holes in the flight deck. Cubberley told the news that men from all over the ship rushed to the area and began pushing planes off the deck into the ocean to avoid more fuel tank explosions, while others threw live ordnance overboard. He said the whole deck was in flames, but the men kept up the fight with fire hoses streaming water and foam. The ship's USS Bainbridge and Rogers came alongside to assist in fighting the fire and rescue crewmen that had been thrown in the water. It took 3 to 4 hours to extinguish the fires. In commemoration of the event in 2012, Enterprise crewman Fire Controlman First Class Atlantis Davis said on the Navy official website America's Navy, "Those sailors were the real heroes. They did what they needed to do to save their shipmates and Enterprise herself. That's something this crew has never needed to do, but we train and prepare to sweat and bleed for the ship just like those who came before us." In all, 28 crewmen were killed, including the crew of the stricken Phantom II. Cox writes that the radar intercept officer, Lieutenant J.G. Buddy Pyatt, was killed in the fire, and the pilot of the aircraft, Lieutenant J.G. Jim Barry, died as a result of the burns months later. Cox explains that a preponderance of those killed were flight deck's maintenance personnel, while other crewmen were killed as they ran bravely towards the fire, and others were trapped in compartments below deck. 314 were seriously injured, many with severe burns. The Newport News Daily Press reported that the ship's 80-bed sickbay was clearly not enough for Tuesday's casualties. One of the Navy's first acts was to call for helicopters to fly in doctors and medical supplies. Frank Peake was sent by helicopter to a hospital in Hawaii. The fire aboard Enterprise demonstrated the risk of operations even away from the enemy, and it was the 3rd major U.S. aircraft carrier fire of the Vietnam War, following the fire on the Forrestal and another aboard USS Oriskany in 1966. But notably, the fire had been extinguished much faster than it had been on the Forrestal, which raged for nearly 12 hours. That was, Cox suggested, a result of the lessons learned from that fire. On Enterprise, 96% of ship's company and 86% of Air Wing personnel had received formal firefighting training, whereas on Forrestal, only 50% of the crew and none of the Air Wing had been trained. That so many on Enterprise were trained was a direct result of lessons learned during the Forrestal fire.
15 aircraft were destroyed. Many others were damaged. Overall, the losses in lost planes and damage to the ship were estimated at $126 million. And yet the ship was repaired in just 51 days and deployed again to Southeast Asia. A review board following the accident suggested many changes, including redesigning the hover so that it would direct its exhaust upwards. For many of the crewmen aboard, having lost friends, the accident represented an end of innocence. Crewman Tom Jorgensen told Newport News TV 10, "You're no longer that adolescent teenager that you were maybe that morning, before it all started."
The Big E was a warrior of the Cold War. Inactivated in 2012, she was not decommissioned until 2017, after 55 years of service. Owing to the complexity of decommissioning nuclear reactors, the ship was considered ineligible to become a museum ship, and is currently still in the process of being broken up.
I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.